In the centuries before the rise of industrial society, the majority of people in England lived a life that was closely tied to the land. Imagine your great-great-grandfather standing in a field, watching a man hammer a fence post into the earth, marking a line that would define his life and his community's existence. That fence, which may have seemed like an ordinary post, would come to symbolize a dramatic shift in the way people lived, worked, and survived. The world your ancestors knew was about to change forever, and that change was made possible by one of the most significant and tragic legal transformations in history. The Enclosure Acts. For much of history, life for peasants, workers, and farmers in England was directly linked to the land they worked on. The common land wasn't just a patch of ground or empty space. It was the foundation of their survival. This land, often shared by many people in a community, was where they could raise livestock, collect firewood, gather turf for roofing, and even cut down wood for fuel. This system of shared resources was known as the commons, and it was, in many ways, the lifeblood of the working class. It was a system that ensured people had access to what they needed to live, without being dependent on the whims of a wealthy landowner or employer. Most importantly, the commons allowed people to be somewhat independent. If they had a cow or sheep, they could provide milk, meat, or wool for their family. If they had a plot of land, even a small one, they could grow food to feed themselves. This was a level of self-sufficiency that is hard to imagine in today's world, where people often rely on wages and jobs to survive. But for many, this land was everything. It was a source of freedom. A person could work the land, live off it, and pass on that knowledge to their children, ensuring that the cycle of life could continue. However, this independence was about to be systematically destroyed, not through a battle or revolt, but through the cold, calculated process of lawmaking. The story of how this happened lies in a series of laws passed by the British Parliament known as the Enclosure Acts. These laws began to appear in the 17th century, but they accelerated dramatically between 1750 and 1860, with over 5,200 separate acts of Parliament being passed, all designed to enclose the common land. At the heart of the Enclosure Acts was a financial land grab that was legal, but devastating. Parliament, under pressure from wealthy landowners, passed laws that allowed the government to survey, divide, and fence off millions of acres of common land. The land that had been used for generations by local communities was suddenly up for sale. But this wasn't just a matter of land being bought and sold. It was a mass transfer of wealth from the poor to the rich. The common land that had sustained families for centuries was sold to the highest bidder, and those bidders were often wealthy landlords or speculators who had little interest in the welfare of the local people. The justifications for these Enclosure Acts were presented as a form of improvement. The government, and the wealthy landowners who influenced it, argued that by enclosing the land, farming practices could be made more efficient. They claimed that the commons were wasted or underused and that enclosing the land would lead to more productive, modern farming methods. On paper, it sounded like a good idea. More efficient farming could mean more food, more resources, and greater wealth. But the reality was far different for the people who relied on the land to survive. As the land was enclosed, the local population lost their right to use it. This wasn't just a loss of land. It was a loss of independence. The people who had once been able to provide for themselves by raising livestock or collecting firewood were now cut off from the land they had always known. Many were forced to become wage laborers, working for a landlord or wealthy landowner in order to survive. The result was a profound shift in the economic structure of the time, one that set the stage for the rise of industrial capitalism and the wage labor system. This loss of the commons was devastating for rural communities. People who had lived for generations on the land were suddenly thrown into a new, unfamiliar world. They were now dependent on the wages they could earn from working for someone else, often in harsh and exploitative conditions. Those who didn't have the skills or resources to work for wages were often forced into poverty, becoming landless laborers who were dependent on the whims of employers. This was the moment that poverty, as we know it today, was engineered. The legal framework that made the enclosure of the commons possible was deceptively simple, but it was incredibly effective. It began not with a public debate or democratic process, but with petitions from local landowners. These landowners, who had a vested interest in privatizing the common land, would argue that the land was wasted or underused. They would present the commons as inefficient and claim that enclosing it would lead to greater prosperity. Once these petitions gained support, a bill would be introduced in Parliament, where landowners had a significant influence. As a result, the laws were often passed with little to no opposition. The most important of these laws was the General Enclosure Act of 1845, which streamlined the process of land enclosure. Under this act, commissioners were appointed to survey the land and divide it into private plots. These commissioners were often local gentry, or people connected to the landowners. Once the land was divided, it was sold off to the highest bidder. The costs of the surveying, fencing, and legal processes were then passed on to the very people who were losing their land. Many small landholders, unable to pay the costs, were forced to sell their plots, often at a loss. This led to widespread debt and financial ruin for many families. The legal system, which once protected the rights of common people to use the land, now worked against them. The rights of the people, based on custom and tradition, were overridden by the law. The law no longer recognized the commoner's right to use the land. It only recognized the rights of those who could prove ownership, regardless of the long history of use. This process was, in many ways, a sleight of hand. What was presented as a measure to improve agricultural efficiency was, in fact, a financial transaction designed to transfer wealth from the poor to the rich. The land that had once been a shared resource was now private property, and the commons, which had once provided for the people, was now off-limits. The people who had once relied on the land for their survival were now forced to work for a living, often for wages that were barely enough to sustain them. The new system that emerged from the Enclosure Acts was one of dependency, where people were no longer self-sufficient but were instead at the mercy of their employers. What's more, the effects of this transformation weren't just immediate. The Enclosure Acts set the stage for the broader social and economic changes that would come with the Industrial Revolution. As people lost their access to land, they moved to cities in search of work. The rise of factories and industrial production created a new class of urban workers, who were often forced to work long hours in dangerous conditions for low wages. The Enclosure Acts didn't just take away the land. They helped create the conditions for the rise of industrial capitalism, where the ownership of land and resources was concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority of people were left dependent on wages to survive. In the years following the Enclosure Acts, the system of wage labor became more entrenched. People were no longer able to provide for themselves through agriculture or small-scale farming. Instead, they were forced to work for others, often in factories or on large estates. This shift in the way people lived and worked was a crucial turning point in history. It marked the end of an era where people could rely on their own land and resources, and the beginning of an era where people were dependent on wages, rents, and loans to survive. The loss of the commons was not just a matter of economic hardship, it was a fundamental shift in how society was structured. The Enclosure Acts took away the resources that had once allowed people to live independently and replaced them with a system that required people to be dependent on others for their survival. It was a shift from a world where people had a stake in the land to a world where people were tied to a financial system that kept them perpetually in debt and dependent on wages. This historical event was not just about land. It was about control. The Enclosure Acts were about taking away the means by which people could support themselves and ensuring that they would be dependent on others for their survival. In the centuries since, the same principles of control and dependency have been applied to many other aspects of life. The idea of ownership has been replaced with the idea of permission, and the commons, once a source of independence, has been monetized, broken down into increments, and sold back to us. The story of the Enclosure Acts is not just a story of the past. It is a story that continues to shape the world we live in today. The principles of enclosure, once applied to land, have been applied to housing, education, work, and even our access to tools and technology. In this modern world, we no longer own the things we use to survive. We lease them, rent them, or finance them. Just as the Enclosure Acts took away the land from the common people, today's financial systems take away our independence by making us perpetually dependent on credit, loans, and payments. The Enclosure Acts were a turning point in history, and their legacy lives on in the systems that govern our lives today. Just as the landless labor of the past was forced into dependency, so too are we, in modern society, forced into a system of financial dependency. Our freedom has not been destroyed, it has been monetized. It has been broken down into small, manageable increments and sold back to us, just as the commons were once sold to the highest bidder. And so the question remains, how do we break free from this modern system of enclosure? How do we reclaim the independence that was once ours, and how do we ensure that we are no longer bound by the invisible chains of financial dependency? This is the challenge that we face today, and it is a challenge that has its roots in the Enclosure Acts of the past. The Enclosure Acts, which systematically privatized the commons and tore apart the fabric of rural communities, were a momentous shift in history. While we often view these legal changes as something that happened in the past, their echoes are still felt in our daily lives today. The principles behind the Enclosure Acts didn't vanish with the rise of industrialization. They evolved, and they continue to shape the way we live, work, and interact with the world around us. The loss of independence through the enclosure of land was only the beginning of a deeper transformation, one that continues to affect the way we relate to resources, wealth, and power. This second part of our exploration focuses on how the same principles that led to the enclosure of the land in the 18th and 19th centuries continue to operate today, albeit in more subtle and financially complex forms. To understand this, we must look at how the system of dependency that the Enclosure Acts created has been extended into modern life. The idea of ownership has been replaced with permission, access, and ongoing financial obligation. And just as the common land was once taken away from people, the very tools, resources, and opportunities that were once within reach have been monetized, leased, or made contingent on credit. Let's look closely at how these mechanisms of control have persisted in various aspects of modern life, especially in housing, education, work, and even technology. Perhaps the most obvious way that the legacy of the Enclosure Acts lives on today is in the realm of housing. For centuries, land was the most important resource that a person could possess. With access to land, individuals and families could survive without relying on others for food, shelter, and warmth. But with the passing of the Enclosure Acts, that independent access to land was taken away and people were forced into a system of wage labor. In a similar vein, today's idea of homeownership isn't as clear-cut as it might appear. Many people aspire to own their homes, and for good reason. Owning a home is often seen as the ultimate marker of financial success, a sign that a person has made it. It represents stability, a sense of permanence, and the potential for wealth building through the value of the property. But if we look closely, we see that the modern housing system doesn't truly offer people the kind of freedom that outright ownership once did. When you purchase a home, most people do so with the help of a mortgage, which is a loan that stretches over several decades. This means that for the better part of your adult life, you will be paying a bank or financial institution for the right to live in the house. This situation bears a striking resemblance to the way that landowners once held power over commoners, only today's system is financially structured to keep people in debt. Until the last payment is made, the bank holds the legal title to the property. This makes you, in effect, a tenant who is paying rent with the promise of eventual ownership, a reality that becomes starkly clear if you fail to keep up with your mortgage payments. If you miss a payment or default on your loan, the bank can repossess your home and sell it. This modern process mirrors the displacement caused by the Enclosure Acts, except now, instead of being driven off land, people are driven out of their homes. The sense of security that we associate with owning a home is contingent on being able to pay, just as the security of people in the past depended on being able to access the commons. In fact, the system of mortgage debt effectively locks people into a state of financial servitude, much as the Enclosure Acts forced peasants into wage labor. The modern mortgage is an agreement that ensures a steady stream of income to banks and financial institutions. This system has led to a generation that spends its life paying for something it doesn't fully own until the very end of the loan term. It's a subtle form of enclosure that keeps people in a constant state of financial obligation, unable to achieve true independence because they are always tethered to the bank, just as peasants were once tied to the landowners. This dependency isn't just an individual issue. It has widespread social and economic implications. The rising cost of housing, combined with high levels of student debt and other financial obligations, means that for many, homeownership has become an unattainable dream. The system that was designed to create wealth for the wealthy few has become a barrier for the majority, who are left to pay off debts for decades. This situation replicates the dynamic set in motion by the Enclosure Acts, where the masses were pushed into poverty while the wealthiest individuals profited from the transfer of land and resources. Another area where the principles of enclosure have been extended is in education. In the past, education was not always available to everyone. The rise of the public education system in the 19th century was meant to ensure that people could improve their station in life, regardless of their background. However, much like the commons were taken away, education has also been monetized and enclosed by financial barriers. In modern society, access to higher education often comes with a significant price tag. Tuition fees at universities have skyrocketed, and many students are forced to take out loans to afford their education. This student loan debt creates a financial burden that follows graduates for years, often delaying their ability to buy a house, save money, or start a family. Much like the peasants of the past who were pushed into a system of wage labor, today's students are being pushed into a system where their financial freedom is constrained by the weight of student debt. The increasing cost of education is a direct result of the privatization of what was once a public good. Just as land was once seen as a shared resource but was enclosed and sold to the highest bidder, education too has been commodified. Higher education has become a means to an end, rather than an avenue for intellectual growth or personal empowerment. It's a tool for securing a job in a competitive labor market, and in many cases, it's a tool for maintaining a status quo that keeps people in debt and dependent on their ability to earn wages. The student loan system, much like the Enclosure Acts, creates a long-term financial obligation that ties individuals to their debtors. Those who take out loans to pay for their education must work for decades to pay off the amount they owe, often while struggling to make ends meet. This system has created a new kind of enclosure, a financial enclosure that ensures people remain tied to their debt and dependent on their ability to work for wages. Just as the commons were once a source of independence, education today has become a means of control where access to opportunity is tied to a financial obligation. In the world that the Enclosure Acts helped create, most people were forced to sell their labor in exchange for wages. This shift from being independent landowners to becoming dependent workers was a central part of the transformation from a rural, agrarian economy to an industrial one. Today, the idea of working for a wage remains deeply entrenched in society. But in recent years, we have seen the rise of a new form of work, the gig economy. The gig economy, where individuals work short-term jobs or freelance assignments rather than holding a permanent, full-time job, has become increasingly common. While this might seem like a step toward greater independence, it is actually a modern extension of the same forces that created dependency under the Enclosure Acts. In the gig economy, people are still selling their labor, but they are often doing so without the benefits or security that a traditional job would offer. Gig workers, often classified as independent contractors, lack job security, health benefits, and retirement plans. They are responsible for their own taxes and expenses. This system of temporary, insecure work means that people are constantly chasing the next paycheck, with little opportunity to accumulate wealth or build a secure future. In many ways, the gig economy mirrors the conditions faced by the landless laborers, who were forced to work for wages after the Enclosure Acts closed off access to the commons. In the gig economy, just as with traditional wage labor, people remain tethered to their need for work to survive. The lack of benefits, the instability of income, and the constant pressure to find the next job create a sense of financial insecurity that can be deeply stressful. This system ensures that workers are always dependent on their ability to earn money, and it gives employers greater flexibility to exploit workers without having to provide long-term security or benefits. In the past, tools were essential for survival and success. Farmers had their plows, blacksmiths had their hammers, and craftsmen had their saws. These tools were their property, and they had the right to use them freely. But in today's world, tools have been replaced by software and technology, and in many cases, these tools are not owned by the people who use them. Take, for example, the software used by millions of people in their daily lives. Programs like Microsoft Office, Adobe Creative Cloud, and other professional tools are no longer owned by the individuals who use them. Instead, users pay a subscription fee, which grants them temporary access to the software. If a person stops paying the subscription, they lose access to the software and the work they've done. This is a modern form of enclosure, where the tools people need to do their jobs are not truly owned by them. Instead, they are rented or leased, and access to them is contingent on the payment of fees. This shift in how tools are accessed has made people more dependent on the companies that provide the software, much like the way people in the past became dependent on the wealthy landowners who took control of the commons. In the digital age, our ability to work, create, and produce is tied to whether or not we can afford to pay for these tools. And this financial obligation creates a new kind of dependency. The Enclosure Acts were a transformative moment in history, not just because they took land from the people, but because they set in motion a system that would create dependency and control. From housing and education to work and technology, the principles of enclosure have been extended into almost every part of modern life. Ownership has been replaced with permission, and independence has been exchanged for a system of perpetual financial obligation. Today, we live in a world where our stability and success are tied to our ability to pay for things. Whether it's a mortgage, student loans, or software subscriptions, we are constantly reminded that the things we use to survive and thrive are not truly ours. Instead, they are leased to us by the financial system, just as the commons were once leased to the wealthy few. The modern world may look very different from the rural England of the past, but the legacy of the Enclosure Acts lives on in the systems that shape our lives. If we are to break free from the cycle of dependence, we must begin to recognize these patterns and challenge the financial systems that keep us tethered to them. The struggle for independence that began with the Enclosure Acts is not over, it has merely evolved. And it is up to us to reclaim what has been taken from us, just as our ancestors once fought to hold on to the commons. As we conclude this exploration of the Enclosure Acts and their far-reaching impact, it's important to acknowledge that the story doesn't end with the loss of the commons or the rise of wage labor. The principles of enclosure control, dependency, and the gradual dismantling of independent livelihoods have continued to evolve and shape the world in which we live today. In fact, the very systems that the Enclosure Acts set in motion are still with us, even if they are more hidden and insidious in the modern world. Throughout this series, we've explored how the Enclosure Acts transformed communities by privatizing common land and forcing people into wage labor. We've seen how these changes have extended into the modern world, with concepts of ownership being replaced by permission and ongoing financial obligation. The way we live and work is no longer about independence and self-sufficiency. It's about maintaining access to the things we need to survive: housing, education, tools, and even our ability to work through ongoing financial payments. But what does it mean to truly break free from this system of modern enclosure? Is it even possible to escape the financial dependency that seems to have been built into every aspect of our lives? In this final part of our exploration, we will delve into the ways that we can reclaim independence and break the chains of modern financial control. The idea of financial independence, or the ability to live without depending on others for your livelihood, may seem like a distant dream in today's world. In many ways, we've been conditioned to accept financial dependency as the norm. We are taught to aspire to home ownership, but that ownership is contingent on decades of mortgage payments. We are taught to pursue higher education, but that education often comes with crushing student debt. We are told that owning the latest tools and technology is the key to success, but those tools are often only accessible through rental agreements, subscriptions, or leasing contracts. The truth is, financial independence has become increasingly difficult to achieve in a world where ownership is constantly being replaced by permission. Whether it's through the housing market, student loans, or the software we use to work, we find ourselves perpetually tied to financial obligations that prevent us from truly owning our lives. The Enclosure Acts of the past set the stage for this, but today it is the financial system that keeps us bound to our debts. To break free from this system, we must first recognize that financial independence is not just about accumulating wealth. It's about reclaiming the freedom to live life on our own terms, without being constantly tethered to payments that keep us in a state of anxiety and dependency. Financial independence is about owning what we need to survive, rather than leasing or renting it from institutions that profit from our need for basic resources. Before we can begin to break the chains, we must first understand how they are formed. The modern financial system is based on debt. Whether it's a mortgage, a student loan, or a car payment, debt is the primary tool used to control access to resources. The system is designed in such a way that we are constantly in a state of owing something, whether it's money or labor, just to maintain access to what we need. The process of taking on debt and the obligation to repay it is not just an individual issue. It is a societal one. Debt has become a tool of control, and the institutions that hold our debt hold the power. Banks, lenders, and financial institutions profit from our need to borrow money, and they ensure that we remain in debt for as long as possible. The entire structure of modern finance is built on this principle. Keep people in debt, and they will continue to work, pay, and generate wealth for those who hold the power. But the power of debt is not just in the financial obligations themselves. It is in the way that debt shapes our choices. The modern system has created a society in which debt dictates everything from our ability to get an education to our ability to buy a home or car. The chains of debt limit our options, making it difficult to pursue meaningful work, start a business, or even save for the future. It ensures that we are constantly focused on the next payment, rather than on achieving true independence or security. Just as the Enclosure Acts forced people into wage labor, the modern system of debt forces us into financial labor. The difference is that today, the chains of debt are not physical. They are invisible, built into the very fabric of our lives. These invisible chains can be just as constraining as the visible fences that once marked the land. Breaking free from the modern system of financial control begins with understanding the mechanisms that keep us in debt. Financial literacy is the first step toward reclaiming control over our financial lives. Understanding how debt works, how interest accrues, and how financial institutions profit from our payments is crucial. But financial literacy is not just about understanding numbers. It's about understanding the larger systems at play. We live in a world where wealth is increasingly concentrated in the hands of a few, and the majority of people are left to struggle with debt, low wages, and rising costs. This concentration of wealth is not a coincidence. It is the result of a system that has been designed to ensure that the wealthy continue to profit while the rest of us remain dependent on wages and credit to survive. To break free from this system, we need to shift our mindset from one of dependence to one of self-sufficiency. Financial literacy can empower us to make better choices, avoid falling into debt traps, and take control of our financial future. It can also help us recognize when the system is exploiting us, whether it's through predatory lending practices, inflated interest rates, or corporate monopolies that limit our access to affordable goods and services. But financial literacy alone is not enough. We need to take action to reclaim the freedom that was lost through the Enclosure Acts and the financial system that has replaced it. This means advocating for policies that promote financial independence, reducing the reliance on debt, and finding ways to create alternative systems of wealth and resource distribution that are not based on exploitation. One of the most effective ways to break free from the chains of financial dependence is to create alternative economic models that focus on collective ownership and shared resources. In the past, the commons provided a system of shared resources that allowed communities to thrive without relying on individual wealth or private ownership. While the commons have been taken from us, we can still build new systems that prioritize cooperation over competition, access over ownership, and shared wealth over concentrated power. There are several alternative economic models that can help us break free from the financial system that keeps us in debt. One such model is the cooperative model, where businesses, organizations, and communities work together to share resources and wealth. In a cooperative, the people who contribute labor, resources, or capital are the ones who share in the profits. This model can be applied to everything from worker-owned businesses to cooperative housing and community land trusts. Another model is the local economy, where communities prioritize buying from local businesses and supporting local entrepreneurs. By focusing on local production and consumption, communities can reduce their dependence on multinational corporations and financial institutions that profit from their labor. A local economy encourages self-sufficiency and empowers individuals to take control of their own resources, just as the commons once did. At the heart of these models is the idea of shared ownership and collective responsibility. Instead of relying on the financial system that keeps us in debt, we can create systems where resources are shared and wealth is distributed more equitably. By working together and building alternative structures of ownership, we can begin to dismantle the chains of modern enclosure and reclaim our independence. Another important aspect of breaking free from the modern system is reclaiming our time and attention. In today's world, we are constantly bombarded with distractions from social media to advertising to the pressures of work and debt. These distractions keep us focused on short-term goals and prevent us from thinking about the long-term implications of the systems we are part of. To break free from the chains of modern enclosure, we must take back control of our time and attention. This means shifting our focus from consumerism and debt to personal growth, education, and creative endeavors. It means prioritizing well-being over work and consumption. Just as the Enclosure Acts took away the land and forced people to focus on survival, today's financial system takes away our time and energy, forcing us to focus on making money rather than living fulfilling lives. By reclaiming our time and attention, we can begin to break the cycle of debt and dependence. We can focus on building skills, creating value, and pursuing meaningful work that is not just about making money, but about contributing to our communities and the world at large. In this way, we can escape the mental and emotional prison created by the financial system and live more freely. The Enclosure Acts of the past were not just about land, they were about control, about creating a system that ensured the wealthy few could profit while the many were left dependent on wages and debt. Today, the same principles of control and dependency continue to shape our world, but they are more subtle and pervasive than ever before. The chains of modern enclosure are not physical fences or land grabs. They are financial obligations, debts, and the constant pressure to work and consume. To break free from this system, we must reclaim our financial independence, build alternative economic models that prioritize shared resources and cooperation, and take back control of our time and attention. We must reject the notion that financial dependency is inevitable, and instead, work to create a world where ownership, independence, and self-sufficiency are accessible to all. The struggle for independence that began with the Enclosure Acts is not over. It has simply evolved, and now it is up to us to continue the fight. By recognizing the chains that bind us and working together to create new systems of wealth and resource distribution, we can reclaim the freedom that was once ours. The future is not written, and it is within our power to break free from the modern systems of control and build a more just and equitable world for all.